In the Emerald Isle, something unexplainable is happening. Tonight, prepare to witness the most frightening event in horror podcast history. A journey into the depths of horror history. First Class Horror presents the Class Horror Cast. Evil wears many masks, but pure horror wears only one. Support First Class Horror on Patreon for as little as $1. Can't get enough of the horror? Carve yourself a deal from official merchandise, only on Teespring. Join us on all social media at First Class Horror. We have such sights to show you.
Anthony DiBlasi followed in his dad's footsteps and became both a horror and movie lover from a young age. All through his teens he made movies and one day vowed to make it to Hollywood. After graduating from film school at Emerson College in Boston, he moved to LA and began interning for Marvel. Through sheer determination, he got an internship and eventually full-time work alongside the legendary Clive Barker. He was key executive and producer on movies such as Midnight Meat Train and Book of Blood. He made his directorial debut with Dread, based on Clive Barker's short story. He directed and co-wrote the critically acclaimed horror movie Last Shift and followed up with Extremity in 2018, which is based on extreme haunts with a twist. Anthony is both a fan of the genre and an expert. We talked about some behind-the-scenes stories you may not have known, some exciting future projects, and some great advice for following your dreams. I hope you all enjoyed this as much as I did. So can you remember your first horror movie that you ever saw or horror-related experience?
Definitely. It was when I must have been, 5. I remember like VHS was just becoming the rage. Mm-hmm. My father had gotten a VCR, and we went to this video store. And I remember walking around in this video store very vividly. And my dad is a big horror junkie. And he rented Phenomenon, which is Creepers, right? Creepers with
mm-hmm.
Jennifer Connelly. And that was, I believe, the first real horror movie I had seen. And my parents let me watch whatever. They were never like, oh, you can't watch that. It's rated R. It's violence and nudity. I watched everything.
Mm-hmm.
Creepers. And that, really stuck with me. I actually watched it pretty recently. And it was a much better movie than I remember it being.
Did that start your love for horror movies at that point, or were you scared of them? Or
I wasn't scared. I was at a really young age. I was really obsessed with movie making. And I don't know, getting into movies, it was something I always wanted to do. And I don't know what it was or I don't remember its origin, but I really was obsessed with the makeup, the model making, and back then you couldn't go online. We're spoiled with the abundance of information now. We get to hey, what was it like building models on, Star Wars, and you look it up on YouTube and you can watch hours of that. But, when I was a kid, it was you'd see something on PBS, Sesame Street. And then there was a 20-minute making of Star Wars. And I'm like, what the hell is this? This is incredible, with models and creature effects. And I was obsessed with that stuff. And I think horror movies, and which is why I love making horror, is because it incorporates so much of different things. Mm-hmm. A little bit of magic, a little bit of illusion, a little bit of creature effects, model making, puppet work. You can do so much in a horror movie and get to essentially play with all these toys as an adult. And that is really and even like the movies that I constantly watch in the horror genre are things like Lost Boys, American Werewolf in London, Fright Night, movies that were really effects heavy and that I continually go back to. And it was all because of that. Nightmare on Elm Street, I remember watching too when that came out on VHS, and that movie did scare me. It definitely gave me nightmares, but then I became kind of obsessed with it because I remember like in third grade or something, like making models out of paper of Nightmare on Elm Street 3 and like playing with it with my friends. So I must have, became kind of obsessive with Freddy Krueger at a young age.
It's funny, how many people have those experiences where, they'll be frightened by something to the point where it becomes an obsession.
Yeah.
So when you said you always were interested and wanted to work in the movie business, did you have any particular aspect of that you had in mind? Like, was it to direct or write, effects? Was there something?
It was effects. Yeah, it was because then that's really all I was really, I don't even know if the other stuff really even I grasped it at a young age.
Yeah.
I was really into the effects and things like that. But then in like grade school, my friends and I, and this happens with so many groups of kids, we had like a group of people we'd make our own movies out of, with a video camera. We'd run around and make these. I still have these things on tape. We'd make these ridiculous, either comedy or comedy horror or action things. And I did that for years, like into my teen years. And then you start being like, okay, I want to go to film school. And then once I got to film school, it was like, okay, directing became writing, and directing and kind of creating. The whole thing became more of a obsession, and I love editing. I edit most of my own movies and edit other people's things too. Editing is something I really enjoy.
Would you say, how was your experience in film school? I always get like mixed answers with that. Some people think that they wasted their time, they could have done it anyway. Then other people feel like it served a purpose to get them where they needed to go.
I loved film school, and it definitely, it all depends on where you end up, right? And so for me, it was totally worth it because it was, if it wasn't for film school, I would have never started working with Clive Barker. So to me, that whole thing was like, all right, it worked, right? My whatever plan it wasn't. And I went to Emerson in Boston, and I chose that school because they had this extension program. You could go to Los Angeles, either your junior or senior, for a semester or it was a semester. So I was like, well, I'm going to try to get into Emerson, do film there. And then my last semester, I'll just move to California, move to Los Angeles. And that's what I did. So made the move, and then you're like you're in this dorm. So you're not having to worry about, I got to get a job. I'm in school. And, when you came to Emerson in California, you had to get an internship or they sent you home. So I started interning with Marvel, and I got an internship with Marvel. And at the time, Marvel, the first Spider-Man hadn't come out yet. So they were really, Kevin Feige was there, and Avi and Ari Arad were there. It was still when they were together, and they had their properties kind of thrown about. in a lot of different places. And they were just finishing Sam Raimi's Spider-Man. And I remember watching the title sequence in the office and being like, whoa, that looks great. And then when that movie came out is when, you know, then everything changed for Marvel. But at the time, I had tons of free time on my hands. So I was talking to my advisor about, can I do another internship? I don't care if I get credit. I just want to take I'm out here. I don't want to sit in my dorm room and drink with, my college buddies. I want to find a way to get a job. Right. So I meet as many people as possible. So I was like, is there anything in special effects? Is there anything in horror? And this kind of came down to, again, the Nightmare on Elm Street box set had come out. It's this great DVD box set that had all the movies and it had tons of special features on it. And Clive was on that box set a lot, which is strange to me. Because the two, I don't know why. I don't know why he was on being interviewed so much on this box set, but he was. And, I'd known, I loved Candyman. I was, a fan of Clive's, but not like, oh my God, Hellraiser. I wasn't like some super fan of Hellraiser or anything. But the way he talked about art, the way he talked about movie making, I was like, I love how this guy, thinks. And I was like, who do you know? Talking to my advisor, and they're like, John Carpenter, there's Wes Craven, there's, Clive Barker. I was like, let me reach out to Joe Daly, who became my producing partner. He was my boss first. Joe was from, the East Coast like I was. He had gone to Emerson for like a semester before he transferred out. I was like, that's a connection. I hounded him for a month until they brought me in for a meeting. And Clive was in that first meeting. And I was kind of like, that was such an opportunity. And I hit it off with them on just lots of different things. Our love for comic books and toys and obviously horror movies, but other movies too. And then I ended up interning for them and then working for them.
Was that a strange experience? Like, was there, I guess, did you feel pressure or nervousness when you go into this room and Clive Barker is sitting there?
In a way, it was better that I didn't know he was going to be there, right?
Okay, yeah.
Because I thought Joe was really, I had talked to Joe, a bunch of times on the phone, and he was really easy to talk to. And when I went up, it was interesting because we had a really unique, the offices were out of Clive's houses. And back then, Clive had 3 houses in a row in Beverly Hills. It was this compound. It was like on lockdown, like this, and our offices were there, and he was doing these massive oil paintings for this Abarat book series. And they were literally hundreds of them lined in this house that we would bring people up. You want to come up and see the paintings? That's where we conduct all our meetings. We did it for years. And it was this great selling tool because people would come into this house and just be overwhelmed by it. Mm-hmm. So yes, I'm walking into this compound of like, and in a lot of ways that's relaxing. I think, because you're walking and you're getting to see like this man's personal collection of movie props and statue. Like you walk into a house, and in a lot of ways that was less intimidating than walking into like an office. And then, Clive being there. I still remember that day pretty clearly. It was exciting, but I don't know if I was nervous, because it was like I didn't have any time to be nervous about it.
And so obviously you get the internship, I assume, and then what happens from there then? When does it start to kind of I guess move up a level, or things get more serious?
It happened really fast. I had a job with them before I graduated.
Wow.
So I was at Marvel when, Joe called me and was like, "Hey, do you want to come on, full time?" He was about to go make this sci-fi movie called Saint Sinner, which they shot in Canada. It was a TV movie, and they needed someone up at the house, in the house in the office with, Clive, kind of like on day to day. So I was like, hell yeah. Like, yes. So I was, it's very, I was very fortunate to have a job, and to be able to like go home to Boston for graduation and know that I was coming back to California with a job lined up. And, the movie business is a roller coaster. It's never like, there's no straight path. It's often feast or famine. Sometimes you have really good years and sometimes you have really slow years. And then you have things with like COVID shuts down everything years. Mm-hmm. But, you just keep writing and keep plugging away, keep developing. But, you try to remember how fortunate I was to even get into the business, to take that path of like, let me go from, suburban, Massachusetts, thinking about like, hey, I'm going to make movies someday. You're literally on the other side of the country, the furthest point from California. And you're like, how do you get to that point? And I was able to get there and then to direct my own films and stuff. And that's you kind of take that for granted, those early years about the steps you have to take and the doors and opportunities that have to open along the way for you to be like, oh, I'm in Hollywood and now I'm making movies. And it's like, oh, now I'm directing a movie, and producing a movie with Clive Barker and stuff. And it's like, it all happens so fast. I was totally thrown in I had a job and Joe was in Canada and we were going, cause it was a very unconventional office space. It's like we were all creatives. There was no business in it.
Yeah.
We had agents and we had Clive's business manager, but that was a totally separate thing. It wasn't like people weren't guiding us on our business decisions. So every decision we were making was coming out of the creative space, which was cool and great to always just throw yourself into like the creative side of things and go to these studio meetings with people I had no business meeting with. Cause Clive didn't care. He's like, yeah, I'm bringing my intern or my assistant, or then this is my, producing partner. He's only, 23. Mm-hmm. And, we're meeting with the head of Universal, right? Cause Clive was, could get whatever meeting at that, then. So it was a trial by fire.
Yeah. It's
for sure.
And it sounds so relatable in a way. Obviously, I haven't been in the same position you have, but just when you say that, you went from, you're in Boston, you're telling yourself, I'm going to make movies someday, I'm going to get to Hollywood, I'm going to do this, to go from that to, working side by side with Clive Barker in his house. And, in front of all these crazy opportunities. And I guess maybe it's just a case of when you're living it, it doesn't, maybe you don't have time and you're just trying to focus on your craft. But it must be crazy to look back at some of that stuff and, that you did do it and you continue to do it. It's got to be a nice feeling.
Yeah, I try to remind myself because there's something about when you're young and you have these infinite dreams that you manifest, right, out of sheer will. And, obviously it doesn't happen to everyone. But from my point of view, you manifest these things because your ego is so willing to dive into it. Mm-hmm. And I think, with entertainment, there's always things that, you know, it's a very jaded industry, and there's always things that beat you down. And I think you got to like always keep that mind. If you lose that mindset, you got to get it back. This sheer manifestation with confidence of, I got to jump into this. You know, this is what I want to do. You know, this is where I'm going to go. And I've had, obviously, you know, I've had a range of success. You know, am I directing a Marvel movie? Not yet. You know, not yet. So it's like
that.
These,
not yet.
You know,
I like
yeah,
that.
it's like, you know, it's like that sheer manifestation of will. You got to try to always hold on to that, so that journey can continue, to not be like, oh, I've achieved it, and now what? You know, I think you always got to strive for that continuation of the story.
Yeah, and it's funny to hear you mention that, and I think people can apply that to probably any dream or anything, like any career path. I mean, so many times you hear about sports stars who, you know, they become, Tyson Fury is famous for saying that, you know, he worked his whole life to become heavyweight champion. He becomes heavyweight champion, and that was the saddest night of his life, because then he was like, I've done it all. There is nothing else for me to do.
Yeah.
And his whole life just fell apart.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that makes sense, right? It's like you have to keep aiming at something, you know, and not just get caught up in the process of it. 'Cause it's like you achieve something and then you're like, oh, I did it. You know, now what? Don't forget that you must, you know, let's shift to something else.
Yeah. Yeah. So was Midnight Meat Train your first kind of big thing with Clive?
Yeah, and I mean, man, it's weird because it's like so much is behind the scenes when it comes to entertainment. It's like getting Midnight Meat Train made was like pushing a boulder up a hill for what felt like an eternity, you know, but I started working with Clive in 2002, and I guess Midnight Meat Train, I think it was like 2008.
Yeah.
I think when we went into production. And even though that's not a super long time, it feels forever because you're developing. We had so many Clive Barker projects set up at so many different studios and with so many different producers, and actively, you know, things like Damnation Game and Dread and Pig Blood Blues and all 20 of his stories and his novels, another 10 of his novels, you know. So you do so much work and you get to so many things where you're like, okay, we got the green light. Oh, we're going to make, you know, Lord of Illusions was going to be this series at Showtime. And we were like, you know, literally like ready to start casting, and then it was like, oh, Kelsey Grammer has a show that's similar, so we're going to kill this project. You know, just so many things like that happened for so many years, and then you know, Midnight Meat Train. That was like, yeah, that was when we got this kind of. That's when the boulder went on the other side of the hill. You know, where all the effort started to accumulate into. To making movies. You know, Midnight Meat Train, which was a pretty big production, and we shot it in Los Angeles, you know, a pretty big budget size film. And, you know, in the States, unfortunately, they pulled the release of it, and there was a whole thing with, you know, getting like dumped in dollar theaters, and it was a whole drama, which kind of hindered the next movies that came out. But yeah, Midnight Meat Train was the first big one.
And that's one I would always recommend to people as well. Sometimes I mention it and I forget that was quite big over here and in the UK. And a lot of times when I talk to people from the States, I actually get surprised when they say, no, I haven't seen it. And I'm like,
yeah, and it was that reason, you know, it was that it had a pretty substantial life. in a lot of different countries. But in America, it got pulled from the theaters at the last minute because it was supposed to come out in May. The trailers were playing in the theaters. There was a an ownership change at Lionsgate, and the movie got pulled from theaters. It got delayed till October, and then they killed the release entirely. And it ended up, they had a contractual obligation to put it in certain theaters, so they ended up releasing it in dollar theaters, so it wouldn't recoup these kind of money thresholds that they had to stay under. So nobody saw it. A lot of people didn't see it in the States.
That's crazy to me. It is nice now to see. I feel like that's one of those films that's kind of found its place now and has at least over here, and Europe and stuff, it does have quite a cult following. And I always recommend it to people. Sometimes like that's on my list of movies that I wish I could erase from my mind and then watch again.
Really?
Yeah. It's just, there's something about it. And I think it was one of those things I had come across. I had heard about it kind of vaguely and then, forgotten about it and other things or whatever. And then it came across me and I was just like taken aback. I didn't expect, not that I expected it to be bad or I wouldn't like it, but I don't know. I had such a better experience than I thought. And it's one that I just revisit over and over again. So for anybody who's listening to this who hasn't seen Midnight Meat Train, stop what you're doing right now, turn off this and go and watch that movie.
It's funny because like Midnight Meat Train, and I don't know, at the time working, that was before Bradley Cooper became like a huge star. And it was, and I was a huge advocate of him being in that movie at the time because I watched Alias all the time and I was a big fan of his. And, that was like his first lead in a feature. He had been in Wedding Crashers which they came out around, he had done that right before this. And that was, a smaller part, but he was the lead in Midnight Meat Train. And it's funny, because there's two movies out. Have you ever seen Out of the Furnace? Mm-hmm. So Midnight Meat Train's in Out of the Furnace. That director put Midnight Meat Train on the in the drive-in.
Yeah,
and and they were saying it was like a nod to Bradley Cooper, and then it was in the movie that him and Jennifer Lawrence did together. The hell was that name of that movie? Silver Linings Playbook. If you go back and watch Silver Linings Playbook, they get in this argument in front of a movie theater, and on the movie theater it says the Midnight Meat Train.
Really?
Yeah, so it's like there's been a couple Bradley Cooper movies where like the directors will put, I mean, obviously he knows he's in the scenes, but like they put, and I always thought that was kind of this interesting thing with like the specter of Midnight Meat Train following Bradley Cooper through his career. Obviously in a kind of tongue-in-cheek way.
That's I don't know. I just feel like that movie is super overlooked even now. And I often, it pops up when people talk about it, and like I don't see too many bad things about it. It's a really solid. Yeah.
Movie. I mean, it's a solid also action movie. I mean, Kitamura did. He just put his stamp on that movie, and it's got some really great, fight sequences in it. It's if you're a fan of Midnight Meat Train, it has do you know much about the behind the scenes drama on that movie?
Not really.
So Midnight Meat Train, the short story Midnight Meat Train, at the end of the movie, it's, you go, and then this is in the movie to some extent, but he rides the train to the end of the line, and he realized that these things called the Founding Fathers are essentially, the butcher has been keeping these ancient creatures at bay. And in the short story, it's this massive, it's almost like this Lovecraftian, very Lovecraftian moment where Bradley's character, and in the short story, I can't remember if his name is Leon in the short story as well, but this torch passing happens, and he's down there, and he's been kind of shown this supernatural world, and then suddenly this Lovecraftian creature comes out of the shadows, and it just remolds his mind. It's just this thing that the human brain can't process. And we had all that in the movie. We shot it. We shot this like kind of epic sequence, and the monsters were much more prevalent. And in the original cut, he kills Mahogany. Spoiler alert. Sorry. You can cut that out if you want. No, but he's, Leon is think he's vanquished the villain, and then his woman's there, and this huge creature comes out of the darkness, and it just picks her up and it bites her in half, and this blood showers down on him. I mean, we dumped like 100 gallons of blood on Bradley Cooper for like a day and a half, and just this shower of blood rains down on him, and he kind of transforms in that moment. And it was this great sequence. And the head of that studio at the time was like, what is this? We didn't sign up. Like, what is this, a monster movie? And it's like, well, yeah, the script was a monster movie. There was this constant battle between Clive and Yuhei on Yuhei's behalf of like, yeah, guys, there's monsters in this movie. Like, there were always monsters in this movie. Why do we keep cutting the monsters out? And like, the further we got into post-production, the less and less monsters we had in the movie. And you end up kind of with the version that you get now, which is not a bad version. It's just, we're cutting around something that you were never meant to cut around.
Yeah, I guess that.
I wish I still had that footage.
Is it's not to cut you off, but I had heard just when you mentioned, behind the scenes stuff, did all those issues have something to do with the fact of how the release of the movie went? And I know in some of the in some countries it went direct to DVD, I think. There's a rumor floating around on the internet, and I'm not sure if it's true or not, that the studio played a part in that because they weren't happy with the.
Oh yeah, it was. Yes, I mean, there were two levels of studio. It was Lakeshore Entertainment, which we made the movie with, and then Lionsgate distributed the film. Mm-hmm. And Lakeshore was great for the most part, except, I won't name names, but the Lakeshore had a division of power, which you would say the executives that we work with on a very intimate level, on a day-to-day basis, and then the head of Lakeshore, which is this kind of more of an overseer who stepped into the process very late in the game and was like, why are there monsters in this movie? And it's like, well, dude, we've already shot like 90% of the film. Like, what do you like? Mm-hmm. What's going on here? So there's that level of production. And then there's Lionsgate. Now, what happened with Lionsgate is, Peter Block was our executive, and he was, the shepherd of the Saw franchise. So we had a very wide release plan for the U.S. It was supposed to be like in 2,500 screens, which was pretty big at the time. Mm-hmm. and it was a summer release, summertime release. And he left Lionsgate, and the new executive wanted to change the direction of kind of where, because Lionsgate at the time was known for a lot of horror, and it was almost like how, New Line was the house that Freddie built at the time when they were jumping into Lord of the Rings. It was similar for Lionsgate. Saw was the house that Lionsgate, made very successful. And then they had a new ownership that wanted to take it into more of an indie drama kind of direction. So Midnight Meat Train just was not, Bousman got caught up in this too with Repo, the genetic opera. Which, granted, Repo is a very specific kind of like musical horror niche. But again, Peter was going to do a lot of things with Repo. And there was a slate of Peter's horror movies that just kind of got annexed. And so it was twofold of I don't know if I can't say if one was connected to the other, or if they happened independently. Like maybe Lakeshore was like, hey, maybe you don't want, there's monsters in this movie. I don't know. Those things happen several months apart. So I don't know if they were connected in any way. I think they both independently happened to the movie, just by coincidence, that these things leading up to that movie's release.
Yeah, it's funny. Anytime you hear stories, at least from what I've heard, where executives tend to come on the scene, especially last minute, it never really breeds good news.
Yeah.
I recently listened to the producer's cut commentary for Halloween 6, and the entire commentary is basically the story of all the executives that were involved and just completely cut the movie to shreds.
Yeah.
To the point where it just doesn't really make any sense. And then I had listened to Rob Zombie on Joe Rogan, and I don't know if I agree totally with this, but Joe Rogan said something. Rob Zombie talked about his experience when he was when he rebooted Halloween, and the studio getting involved constantly and having multiple pages of notes every single day and changes every single day. And Joe said to him that he's like, I feel like executives that do that were just guys who weren't creative enough to be on the other side.
Yeah.
And then they just butt in with their ideas.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a lot of it. I'm very like diplomatic when it comes to working with executives. I'm like, in entertainment, I feel like there's no such thing as a bad idea. Just like there's almost no such thing as a good idea. Like art is too subjective to have such thing as good and bad ideas, because for every, you're going to have your most favorite movie in the world, and there's going to be a guy you're going to run into that is going to be their least favorite movie in the world. So I feel like working with executives has always been it's a business of entertainment, and that's where there's always a disconnect between money and and art, and oftentimes those things clash. And yes, a lot of the hard thing about executives at a studio level is sometimes you'll be working with an executive for a year, and then they'll either leave or get fired, and then and then a new one will come on, and they'll have a whole different set of ideas, be them good or bad. And you're like, but wait, we've just been working on this for a year, and now we're going to take it in a totally different direction. I think the thing for like people who are just fans of movies who aren't in or aren't close or don't talk to filmmakers or don't make their own films on the side, the thing that's hard for them to understand is the money part of it. Like, I think people are like, man, that was a shitty movie. How did that happen? they think that because someone's spending millions of dollars on something that somehow they're going to have their shit together, right? Mm-hmm. During production and during pre-production, and during post-production. And just like Rob Zombie was probably pointing out, that's just not the case. You know, we were so far deep into Midnight Meat Train shooting that movie when someone comes into the process and it's like just picking up the script for the first time, you know?
Yeah.
And they're like, wait, so what's going on with this movie? I hate this movie. And someone, their assistant being like, oh yeah, they're shooting that, they're like 6 weeks deep into production right now. And he's like, what? Wait a second. I got to get over to set. Like that happens. And I think what's great about what Kevin Feige's done with Marvel is that I feel in some ways taken that out of the equation. They've been very smart in essentially doing pre-production on planning so far ahead in things. Of course they have their problems and the issues that come up, but you get a sense that they're doing pre-production. They're pre-visualizing these movies 3 years before they put the actors in front of the camera.
Yeah, so we don't have like hours before a shoot change the entire thing. Yeah, that makes sense.
And I think because of it, they've had such success in pleasing their viewership. Even if one's like, oh, that wasn't the best Marvel movie, or oh, that was great. I'm pouring water. I'm not urinating. If you can hear that. Either way, the fan base is usually pretty pleased by the outcome.
Yeah. So at the time Midnight Meat Train released, had you already been at that point then working on Dread?
Yeah, we were. I believe, started writing Dread around that time when we were shooting Midnight Meat Train. We knew we were about to shoot Books of Blood, which we shot in Scotland, and that the same company was going to shoot another movie, and it was Dread. At the time, it was either going to be Dread or Pig Blood Blues, because I had written Pig Blood Blues first. I'd written a draft of that first, and we ended up going with Dread. And then and that Dread had been in the studio system. It was at Fox for like four years, and it was going through several different writers and director attachments, and we just couldn't get it done because they wanted to make it PG-13 and there were several executive changeovers and we had great scripts and great versions of it, but it just wasn't going to get done there. So when we got it in turnaround, we got it back from Fox, and, Clive was like, you should do this. We need it to be, it's got to be R-rated. It's got to be like the short story, which was the one thing that was frustrating about the studio is they really wanted to cut the heart out of what the short story was. And maybe it's too niche for people, too psychological, but like the first thing to go was always that meat scene in the short story, which is in its entirety in the movie that I directed. Because I was like, that is the core of the story. Yeah. Is this meat sequence. It's like, if you cut that sequence out, then, what's the point? What's the point of making it? It was such reading that sequence and reading that short story. That was the whole psychology of the project. So I was glad we got to keep it in its entirety.
And when Clive had said to you, you should do this, was he referring to the screenplay or directing and everything, or did that come afterwards?
At that time, I was definitely so involved. You know, it was a producer named Jorge Saralegui was on board Midnight Meat Train and Books of Blood and Dread. He became our producing partner for a lot of these movies, and Joe Daly, you know, who was with Clive for a really long time. And I definitely put my hat. They always knew I wanted to direct. Mm-hmm. You know, that like my creative energy was always, you know, going in that direction and writing to direct. And I honestly don't remember how much of it went hand in hand. It was probably one conversation of like, I'm going to start writing Dread and I want to direct it. And I think because Clive was so supportive at that time, and they all were of that at that time, I had I want to say lucky. I mean, I was lucky to have such a good experience working with people I was very close to. But, you know, we had done the legwork for many, many years leading up to that moment where they were confident in my ability to get behind the camera for the first time, you know, without having directed any shorts or anything like that.
Yeah, because that was something I was going to ask. Did you think that, I guess, having so much experience with this and having all these different plates spinning, that you had been involved so much that, I don't want to say it was a no-brainer, but you were kind of at that point like overqualified in a way to take that on and direct.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, we all were at the time. Clive, Joe, Jorge, myself, we had done so much development hell with so many different studios on so many different Clive projects that getting to these moments of making these movies, let's say independently, you know, with, you know, Matador Pictures in the UK, that we were relieved. You know, there was this certain kind of like the core team, we were the only ones involved. It was such an easy process. Everyone got along. We were like creativity to the max. That was a really fun shoot. Dread was, and just very well organized, very well thought out. And yeah, and you know, we were shooting. You know, Midnight Meat Train was in post. We were shooting books. What had happened is when we were shooting Books of Blood, I was in Scotland doing like the final rewrites on Dread while they were shooting Book of Blood. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I was splitting my time from going to set and then working in the, you know, apartment in Scotland on the script and getting it ready and talking about, you know, is this going to go? How quickly is it going to go? Where are we going to shoot it? And, you know, we were very well organized at that time. So it was kind of like, it was almost a no-brainer because it was like bringing in, even though I had not directed before, you know, I knew this material. I knew it like the back of my hand before I started writing the script. Mm-hmm. You know, so it's like then when I sat down to write this version of the script and, you know, worked with these guys every step of the way to get it where we were all happy with it, it was, you know, putting the right team in place and getting on set, and everyone was confident about it. So I didn't have any hiccups. It went really well when I directing that movie.
And so from that point then, when that happens, were you eager to get in the director's chair again as soon as possible? Did that kind of further you wanting to do that?
Yeah, I mean, we had Dread had, you know, when we were doing post on Dread, and there were talks of like, are we going to do Pig Blood Blues? but by that time, the whole things with Midnight Meat Train had happened in the States, and it derailed our progress a bit because we were rolling out a series of these Books of Blood movies. Are we going to do Age of Desire? Are we going to do Pig Blood Blues? Are we going to do, In the Hills, the Cities? We had so many already written. We were going to reboot Rawhead Rex. And it kind of took those things off the table. So I started, developing other things outside of that world with Clive. And I ended up doing something else. Shooting in the States, I ended up doing Casadega. And it's, I don't remember how long after it was I had finished Dread that I was behind the camera again.
Yeah, because
I don't know if it was
Casadega came out in 2011, I think.
Yeah, I think so. And it was, I don't know if it was a year or 2 years after.
So would that be considered a quick turnaround, or is that a long period of time?
It was pretty quick. I mean, it was a pretty quick, because these things all bleed together in the sense of like, if you go on IMDb, it's going to give you a date, but it's probably the date we first put in there, and it wasn't the date the movie actually came out.
That makes sense.
It was the date we started working on. It's the date that you have to start making a production company is usually when you enter it into like the public record. And so these timelines kind of bleed together in terms of like, well, when were you actually shooting the movie? When were you in post-production on the movie? How long was post-production? Dread had a really long post-production, and I was in London for almost a year after we finished principal photography, editing with the editor and then test screenings and coming back to LA to do test screenings and things like that. And it felt like a pretty quick turnaround. And then I was pretty busy doing from like jumping from Casadega to Missionary and to Last Shift and doing other things, doing a couple shorts and then other things. So I was busy during that time period of kind of nonstop.
Casadega, I think, is one of those movies as well that I had come across possibly on DVD. Again, just kind of a coincidence. I'm quite the movie file, so I will kind of pick up anything. And I can't remember where I had originally seen it, and I was actually pleasantly surprised. There's a good mix of kind of, I don't know if you want to call it romance and the horror and tension in it, and the suspense, I guess, that's kept throughout. And I thought the payoff at the end was quite good. It's another one that I hear people talk about again from time to time, and it always gets quite a positive. I guess it's like you said, everything is subjective, but I always find the people who are kind of diehard for it, which is nice to see.
It is nice to see. I mean, it's such a different movie. I really kind of wanted to make this almost romantic, supernatural giallo movie with Casadega. It had a lot of those kind of gothic elements, southern gothic elements to it. And I think it's bred from I love so many different kinds of movies. So, I like exploring kind of different spectrums, with Dread being such a psychological horror film and pretty, some people watch Dread and they're like, oh, I want to slit my wrist now, and then, Casadega was just such a different kind of movie. And had some more emotional beats to it and supernatural elements and things like that. It wasn't until I did Last Shift where I was like, when we made Last Shift, I was like, okay, now I want to make a scary movie. Like, and I'm not joking. Like, that was the first time I was like, now I want to make a scary movie, a movie that's going to scare people. Like, I had one objective with Last Shift. I just want to scare people. I want people to put on a movie for 90 minutes and just be afraid. And I had never done that before. with my other movies. It was more about a character thing or a story element or things like that. I wasn't really thinking about like, oh, I got to scare people.
Yeah. Because that was something I was going to bring up. Last Shift is definitely one of my, I guess you could call it a comfort movie. It goes on an awful lot. Strange to say a movie like that would be considered a comfort. But it's just one of those movies. Yeah, I used to call it guilty pleasure, but someone told me that can be kind of offensive. It's more of a comfort movie is the word you're looking for.
It's a guilty pleasure. It's like putting on porn.
But like, I remember the first time seeing that movie, and it was like, I would have been like an adult, well into my adulthood at this point. And I think I want to say I had the house to myself for a night, no kid, anything. And I want to say Last Shift was being shown on maybe the UK horror channel. And it was like super late at night, like 3 a.m., 4 a.m. And I started to watch this thing, and not very often does it happen where like something will get me, but I genuinely had chills watching this movie. I don't know whether it was a combination of just being home alone, which is something I'm not used to. The fact that it was so late at night, and the movie kind of caught me off guard. I had it on in the background and might have had a laptop or something out. And I was just kind of like, hey, what's this? I put the laptop away, put the phone away. And I just kind of got sucked into the storyline. And it felt really isolating. And maybe the fact then that I was tying it into the fact that I was actually alone. The silences, that sense of like building dread was actually terrifying, to be honest.
It's interesting because The Last Shift, it's almost I enjoy watching horror movies with lots of people, and a movie like Last Shift, it's almost so intimate and quiet that watching it alone makes more sense. Like it's almost like playing a video game by yourself. You putting on the headphones and like playing a video game alone. It can have that very like immersive feel to it. If you watch it by yourself, you're just like in this woman's shoes the whole movie from this kind of first person point of view. I think a lot of people have that kind of, I think we made it like that. It was an intentional, like first person kind of over the shoulder. Let's go on this journey with her in a very intimate way. Cause we played with the sound so much in that movie. It was such a big part of why I wanted to make that movie, was to have this immersive soundscape where, you could kind of watch it on your phone with some headphones, or watch it on your laptop, or watch it on your big TV and have different experiences with it.
Where did the idea for the movie originally come from, or when did you start to work that out?
I had done Missionary in Casadega with the same producer, and I had worked with the same sound team on that movie, and it was in Florida, and I saw how capable these sound guys were, and I started to like think about how can I make a smaller movie that we can really keep reins on, and design it so much around the soundscape and let the sound team really have at it. And controlling those sound aspects from very early on in pre-production and during production and like taking it to its fullest in post. So that's where it started. And it was kind of this, I originally called it Dispatch, and it was going to take place at a dispatch location with one kind of cop or dispatch worker on their own. And then Scott Boyley, who's the co-writer and producer on it, we started to collaborate on like, let's write this together and take it from there. And it kind of evolved into this kind of Manson-esque assault on Precinct 13 mishmash where, you know, we could really utilize the elements of, you know, kind of getting on a, you know, like a fair horror haunted house on a fair. I like this element of, like, I don't know if you have the, you know, in the States we have the county fair, you know, and there's this dilapidated, you know, haunted house that you like get in a seat and janky, you know, moving through this janky haunted house on this rolly thing, and, you know, these witches pop out. I really wanted to kind of embrace this, get on this ride and just go with it kind of feel. But that's what it evolved from, this kind of design element of sound and keeping it contained.
Yeah, and it's funny because, you know, when you think about it, the lack of dialogue and stuff maybe sometimes would seem like, man, there's not much going on, but it really worked because, like you said, then the sound and the atmosphere nearly felt like a character. And I mean, we've got a police station, which I would assume majority of people would associate with safety, is now no longer the case. It's more like a prison, I guess, in a way. And it's, I don't know, it's a weird, it's a weird story. It kind of flips everything on its head, and you kind of get, like I said, you get sucked into that, that isolation, that silence. And it's, I don't know how to explain it, but it drew me in so much more. The fact that, you know, she is on her own, and I kind of felt like I was right there.
Yeah.
And it worked really, really well.
And, you know, there's certain things about Last Ship that, you know, I don't know, they weren't like intentional, meaning like we weren't like, hey, let's do this before we started writing it. But a couple things that people often respond to is the fact that most of the movie is very well lit. You know, it's a very bright movie. There's a lot of lights in it, you know, a lot of fluorescent lights in it. And then the fact that the lead is a police officer, and, you know, she's a rookie police officer, and she has a duty, you know, she has a job. And you take these two elements of like what you would consider a very competent person and a very well lit location, and say, hey, we're going to make a horror movie. And this is our starting point. And, you know, where does that go from there? So it's almost like most horror movies start from the opposite of that, right? Like dark location and, you know, some, you know, what's the word? Helpless person, you know, helpless maiden, you know, going on this journey of being terrified. You know, they often terrify you by giving you people who are in a compromised position. You know, this person has a gun, you know, on her belt. So it kind of turns things on its head in a different way, I think, right from the get-go.
And how was, once the movie comes out, like, because I feel like that this is a movie I see come up a lot. A lot of fans made a lot of noise online. How was the reception for you, or the experience after the movie had come out, and, you know, all these people were coming forward and it was constantly talked about?
I mean, it was great to have a movie that was so well received. And, you know, I guess something that you would say had that, it got a pretty solid release with Magnolia here in the States. But they did not put it in theaters, and they did not, you know, it was a strong release on VOD, and they did like Blu-ray and DVD. The thing that was the thing that I wasn't expecting is it could not get into a festival to save its life. It really didn't understand that, because I was like, to me, it felt like this was the perfect movie for a festival. and it just couldn't get into a festival. And it was like, and at that point we were like, geez, is this movie, are people not going to like this movie? Is it not what we thought it was? And then we sold it directly to Magnolia, and they, gave it a pretty solid release. And then, then people really started to respond to it. And then when it hit Netflix, it really kind of took on a bigger life.
Yeah.
Of like, okay, people really like this movie and it's delivering on the scares. And so that felt great. That felt great to have the audience, really respond to it and to have it do what it was meant to do, which was like, scare people. It was, scaring people is not, it's like comedy. It's like you could hit or miss with a scare. It's not easy. It's not easy. So it's like when you get a consensus, like, oh, this movie is freaking people out. That's great.
Yeah. And I love, just when you mentioned Netflix, I love when, movies that maybe came out a couple of years ago can have this resurgence. I had seen it when it popped up on Netflix over here, at least. It sat in like the top 3 in your country right now for weeks.
That's great. Yeah.
It's nice to see that, even though the movie had been out for a few years at that point, it's nice to see it get that exposure.
It definitely is, and that's something I still hope for with Dredd. Dredd, yeah. Dredd was I love Dredd. I love that movie. Yeah. And sure I made it, but it's like, a lot of people make movies and they're like, oh, I can't watch those movies. And at the time, I had seen Dredd so many times, you get sick of it and, playing the festivals and, that was like a different thing. Like Dredd did pretty well in the festivals, and it's funny how you look back at something, because I made Dredd at a time where independent, like when we were making Dredd and making Midnight Meat Train, I couldn't give a rat's ass what was playing at Sundance. Mm-hmm. Like that was like, you're caught up in this studio executive world. I had no idea what was going on in the festival market. It just wasn't, we didn't have time for it. And then when Dredd came out, some festivals reached out to us and said, hey, we want to play Dredd. And I was like, great, not realizing, oh, that's a great opportunity, Dredd playing such great festivals and stuff and around the world. And I went to as many as I could. And it's funny, in hindsight, I got so sick of traveling, I skipped a couple that I had wished I like Busan in Korea. I wish I had gone and experienced that, but I didn't go, because I had been traveling so much. Mm-hmm. I was like, I wanted to be home and in LA. And, but when Dredd came out, I felt like, with Clive's name on it, it just did not find its audience. It was released in a very strange way in the States, part of this, and to be completely honest with what happened with Dredd, it ended up, and I don't know if I've said this before in other interviews or whatnot, but it ended up changing hands through a bank deal. And it ended up with After Dark Films, and they released it under, the bank was essentially like, take this deal because it's the most money. But, the producers were like, well, we don't want to take that deal because it's not the best release. But it ended up going through this 8 film. In the States, it was called After Dark Films, 8 Films to Die For. Yeah,
I actually have a copy. I have 2 copies of Dredd, and that's one of them, I think.
And that's one in the box set. And it's like, and those guys were great. The guys I worked with at After Dark were great. I liked all of them and got along with all of them. We had a really good experience. But it was confusing. It was a confusing thing. And it was pretty big in LA for a while, this 8 Films to Die For. Like, they had billboards everywhere. And it was like, they traveled, it was like a multi-city. It was they were really putting their efforts into building the festival and not the movies.
Yeah.
So when you get something that is so convoluted, of like After Dark's 8 Films to Die For, Clive Barker's Dread. You're like, well, what am I watching? Like, what?
Yeah.
Is this a film festival? Is it a movie? Is it a short? And I think it just confused people. And because of that, Dread never had its legs. It never found its footing in a mainstream way. And I think it played maybe Showtime or HBO in its early days. But I'm hoping that Dread finds an audience so many years later. And you think it will, because it's a Clive Barker movie. I mean, Clive's about to have I think a pretty big resurgence right now because of Candyman, and he's got the rights back to Hellraiser, and he's got a lot going on right now.
I really hope that Dread does, and I can definitely speak to what you said. I remember originally picking up that DVD and not really, because I can't remember, there's another movie that I had that fell under the same banner, and at the time I mustn't have searched it online or whatever, but I just found it really odd. I was like, what is this? I don't understand. What are these movies being released under? I don't get
right. It's confusing.
Yeah.
There's another movie that was quite solid was Lake Mungo.
That's
which
it,
was
I think.
That's the one. And that was a very good film that got caught up in the same. And you never want to be like, Lake Mungo. I don't know if those came out the same year or came out separate year, like the year after each other. And you don't want to be that movie where people are coming up to you and saying, "Oh, that was the best movie out of the 8."
Yeah.
I don't want to be in that position. I mean, I guess it's a better position than being called the worst movie out of the 8. But you know what I'm saying? Like, you don't want to be the movie that should, the movie that costs more than all the others, or the movie that has better production design or better production value or better scale. You don't want that, because movies like Lake Mungo and Dread have to find the audience because it wasn't meant for them. It wasn't meant for that audience. That audience was watching different kinds of movies. So most people who saw 8 Films to Die For were kind of like, oh, Dread was a little too highbrow. It was a little too psychological. Like Mungo was too, that was a found footage, like a Paranormal Activity. It was quite ahead of its time. You don't want to be those movies when people are looking for a certain kind of film from 8 Films to Die For, which is more of I think they were going for a midnight movie popcorn audience.
Yeah. And I mean, from the lineup they had as well, it just, those 2 movies in particular, Dread and Lake Mungo, kind of stick out among the rest, as maybe not really fitting with that brand they were going for.
That brand, yeah.
Like they had movies like The Butterfly Effect 3 and all these different things. And I don't know, they just stick out as not being part of that overall umbrella.
Yeah.
I do definitely feel like that probably held that back.
Yeah, and we'll see. And it's good. I mean, obviously it's good. It's a Clive Barker movie. And I think when you have such a brand, his movies will always have a rebirth, even if it's 10 or 12 or 20 years later. It's like there's always going to be people packaging, what are, the 10 best Clive Barker movies? Let's put them in a box set. Like, let's sell that package to a streamer, a new Candyman comes out. People are saying, what's this? Who wrote this? And then they're going back and exploring his other films.
Support First Class Horror on Patreon for as little as $1. Can't get enough of the horror? Carve yourself a deal from official merchandise only on Teespring. Join us on all social media at First Class Horror. We have such sights to show you.